Perfect. Thank you so much. And I'm really sorry that I don't seem to be able to have my camera on, but I hope you can hear me well. So thank you so much for the invitation. So this is a presentation that that is very related to the one I presented to the Symposium of Analysis Económico in December. And I will talk about this paper on the impacts of real-time pricing, but I will also tell you about some other papers that I have. The big topic is thinking about what are the distributional impacts of the energy transition that we are undergoing. And as you know, this winter we are talking a lot about this because energy prices are so high for natural gas. So there's this huge effort to reduce carbon emissions, and a lot of emphasis has been put on the electricity sector because it's one of the most easy to decarbonize. For a long time, the decarbonization strategy in the electricity sector was to move away from coal and go into natural gas, but that strategy is no longer enough. And more we are trying to transition to a carbon-free electricity sector that will not rely on natural gas. So there are some concerns about whether that's possible. And one is that renewables are not necessarily available when we need them the most. And one typical example is solar power, although there are innovations that are making solar power more and more useful in the evening. There's also a concern with wind that's available when it is, but then sometimes all of a sudden you have no wind. So these are some concerns on the limits of the decarbonization. The other one is the speed of the transition. We need to do this very fast, but sometimes, and especially in Europe, deploying some of these investments is very slow. So if you think about renewables and the fact that you need to build oftentimes transmission lines, siting a transmission line, building a transmission line is kind of difficult. So these are all challenges that we are facing. There's also the increase of extreme events that make the transition even more important because it's kind of a way to also protect ourselves. But at the same time, it might leave many households behind. And as we know, the households that are most exposed to extreme events tend to be the poor households. And all of this is a challenge, and I think technology will not save it. I think it's important to pay attention to all these different challenges and try to find the cheapest solutions that can also be implemented as quickly as possible. So I will, let me open my slides on my computer because I cannot see them quick enough. One concern we have with this energy transition is that there will be these very disparate outcomes. And again, what's happening this winter, it's kind of already something that should be of concern. It's also happening when it comes to solar power at home. There are some policies like net metering that make it very attractive for rich households to put solar panels, but oftentimes the lower income households don't have access to these investments, or they cannot afford these investments. They don't find a way to participate in the transition and are left behind. So on top of being left behind from the investments, they are also more affected when it comes, as I said, to extreme events. So what's happening in California, for example, which oftentimes is kind of a sneak peek of what might happen in other places, is that the richest households have solar and backup batteries like a Tesla wall or something like this. So when the grid falls, they live in the best houses, they have solar, they have their backup battery, and on the contrary, the poorest households, they live in very poorly insulated houses, and they lose access to electricity. So these are all kind of concerns. This is kind of on the motivation of the topic, but I do think it will be very important to take into account down the road and try to think about how we as economists can help mitigate some of these inequities. So this is the bigger picture. I put also some pieces of news that kind of highlight why this is relevant. I try to always talk about this, even if it's not exactly the paper that I'm presenting, because I do think it's really important to have more and more people working on this. So this is an example from Texas, where there was a huge cold snap. and many natural gas power plants couldn't function because they are not prepared for cold in Texas, and it left many households with huge electricity bills. This is related to the paper I will present today, where we look at the impact of real-time pricing. So in Texas, some households were on real-time pricing, and the price of electricity went to $10,000 per megawatt hour. So even much larger than what we are seeing today. And in very few hours, in very few days, they had bills of $15,000. On top of that, some households couldn't run electricity because there were huge blackouts in the country, and several people died from this event. So these are all concerns that are likely correlated with income. This is a final example on why income matters. So here you can see a piece of news of Santa Barbara installing solar panels to protect themselves against this type of event. But if you know the geography a little bit of California, Santa Barbara is an extremely rich zip code. So many of these investments to protect ourselves will end up happening in the zip codes where people are already most protected. And as you know, we are now very concerned about the equity impacts. Let me see if I can pass the slide. No? Sorry, I'm trying to pass the slide. It's not passing. Can you put a slide 8? I don't seem to be able to, to move it.
Maybe we can try to move it for you. Christina, could you please try to move it for?
Yes, I must be the presenter.
Yeah, okay.
Okay.
I was trying to
roll. Okay.
Oops,
Thank
no,
you.
I did something.
Here it is more equity concerns.
We are seeing a slide 8. Okay, I see nothing. Okay, but I have them in front of me.
Number 8.
Yes. Yeah. So as you know, we are now very worried about the impact of natural gas, and this is something we are doing in the paper to try to see, okay, how does natural gas prices impact households? And obviously it has huge implications for energy poverty. So these are many questions. It's just a bit of a highlight, but I wanted to kind of talk to you about this because I do think it's very important that we spend more time working on this. So now I will switch a little bit to more specific research of mine. So if you can go to slide, maybe a slide 11. Yeah, this is kind of huge need to work on this. And I do think it's very important that we are open-minded and we collaborate with many people. So it will be very important to work with engineers, work with people closely related to communities so that we can make sure that these investments are happening and are protecting households. So I put an advertising slide in slide 12, where I basically tell you about my ERC project that just started, and the goal is to precisely understand how the energy transition is affecting different parts of mostly the electricity sector, which is my area of expertise. So I wanted to, if you can go to slide 13, I wanted to talk briefly about some examples of why distributional concerns matter. And I have a few papers looking at them. I have one more focused on the supply side of the electricity sector. It's this one of the efficiency and sectoral distributional implications of large-scale renewable policies. I have one looking at the impact of wind power policies in Spain. And then I have the one that I will present in more detail. So if we go to slide 14, this is a first paper that I wrote looking at what happens when we subsidize renewables. As you know, it was a big policy in Spain too. I used California data to try to see what happens if the subsidies to renewables are paid by industrial customers, are paid by commercial customers, or are paid by residential customers. You may know that in Europe, many times the subsidies were paid by residential customers, but not by industrial customers. And indeed, it was studied under the EU policy as an industrial subsidy. Was this an industrial subsidy that was making electricity cheap for industrial producers but expensive for residential producers? Obviously, it's very unequal to charge residential households, but one could think that Ramsey pricing could be justified, could justify this type of pricing. As you may know, the Ramsey rule says that you should charge the highest prices to the least elastic consumers. And as we know, residential demand for electricity is very inelastic. So from a Ramsey point of view, it's not particularly equitable, but it might be justified to charge industrial producers, to charge residential producers. What I showed in the paper is that the Ramsey rule changes when there are externalities. And when there are externalities, in reality, it's not clear that you want to charge the least elastic consumer. Actually, you want to charge the most elastic consumer, because what you're hoping is that people will change their behavior and they will reduce their emissions. So there's no point in taxing people that will not change their outcomes. It's better to tax the industrial producers. So this was kind of to fit into this debate of whether it is unfair to charge the residential households, and it was giving some more economic thought on that. The big finding, however, is that Ramsey prices that target the industrial sector are only useful if the industrial sector is truly elastic. And what happens many times with these policies is that if you tax electricity for the industrial sector, they will generate energy in other ways. So it not might be through productions. So this was kind of one paper, kind of a sneak peek to a paper. Another paper that I have that's also very relevant to Spain, if you can go to slide 17. So this one was looking at, again, this question of who benefits from wind subsidies. So it's very related to the previous paper, but it's much more empirical in nature. I was using data of 10 years from Spain, and basically we were looking at the impact of wind along several dimensions. We focused on a particular policy change that changed the subsidy from being production-based to investment-based, because it had huge distributional implications. So these are the findings that we find. So we find that even though consumers paid for the subsidies, they actually benefited from the wind subsidies because they did reduce electricity prices. So this is a finding that other people have also found in other markets, for example, the Nordic market. So it's kind of a bit counterintuitive. But even if you pay for the wind farms, you can win. And then obviously the bigger losers were the traditional producers, not the wind producers. So what we looked at is what happens when the subsidy is not paid at the margin, but as an investment subsidy. The key difference is that then consumers pay the subsidies, but the price of electricity is no longer as low. And this is what happened in Spain. So that policy change actually ended up being a transfer from consumers to the traditional producers. I think it might be next slide. Yeah, so this is the policy change. So it's basically to highlight that how we design markets actually has huge impact on who the winners or the losers are from the energy transition. So this is the two sneak peeks in case you want to look into these topics. And now I will focus more on the final one, which is the one that I will explain in detail. It's this paper to look at what happens when we have real-time pricing, and especially focused on within the residential sector, whether the high or the low income are better off. So this is a different paper than the previous two, because the previous two were much more aggregate. It was thinking, okay, are the consumers benefiting? Are the producers? Are the wind farms benefiting? Here we will look at the residential households specifically, and we will be asking if we shift into more volatile prices, into real-time prices that depend on renewable production, natural gas prices, and everything else, who benefits. So the data we have is much more detailed than in the previous two papers. It's smart meter data from millions of households, and we will develop some methods that they will explain in detail to try to see, again, who are the winners and who are the losers. So this paper is, as I said, using very detailed data from Spain in the context of a policy change you might be aware of. So in 2015, Spain shifted the default tariff. They made the default tariff real-time pricing. This means that the price of electricity changes with the wholesale price of electricity automatically for a large share of residential customers. As a concept, people are typically opposed to this type of pricing because it can be uncertain and people are worried about price spikes, for example, what happened in Texas. So it's kind of a big question whether making this the default policy can be detrimental to households. So what we find is that going from annual prices to monthly prices is regressive. And the reason is very related to what's happening this winter. Low-income households, or to be precise, a subset of low-income households, those that hit themselves with electricity, highly benefit from having winter price insurance. So not facing the Filomenas or these events that really increase the price of electricity. What we find, however, is that going from monthly prices, so a flat price in a month, compared to daily prices or hourly prices, is actually progressive. And low-income households generally would benefit from price changes during the day, but not from price changes during the year, which can often be much bigger. So the literature, I put here some papers, but it's very related to papers that look at equity issues when it comes to electricity pricing. Early papers often focus on nonlinear pricing, the idea that if you consume a lot of electricity, similar to water, you will start paying more at the margin for your water or electricity. More and more, we have papers that look at fancier forms of pricing, which have been enabled by smart meters. And Severin himself, Severin Born, has a paper looking at critical peak pricing, and some people have papers looking at RTP, real-time pricing, in Chicago. So in our, if you can go back 1 second. So one methodological challenge we have in our data is that we don't know the income of every household. So we know the smart meter consumption of every household, but we don't know their income. So our people will be related to the literature, often related to tax fraud, that tries to infer income based on observed consumption patterns. In our case, the observed consumption patterns will be the smart meter data. So by looking at how people consume the electricity, we will try to infer what their income is. So the context, I already told you a little bit about it, and some of you might know about it. But it's basically with the Spanish data looking at the fact that they defaulted all households, the regulated tariff became a real-time pricing tariff. Now everyone knows more about the electricity than we used to. As you may know, the electricity price has two components, the energy price and the price, la tarifa de acceso. So what changed is the energy price. The part of the energy in your bill, it's what's called energy charges. The price became the wholesale price of electricity, the one that you hear about in the news a lot, and that you might have heard as la PVUPC. The access price during this period was not changed, but you might also have heard about it a lot because this is what got changed last June, when the price of putting the washing machine in the middle of the evening became very expensive. This is the access price. This paper is not looking at the access price, la tarifa de acceso. This paper is focused on the real-time pricing, what happens when the price of electricity reflects wholesale market fluctuations. So it will be focused on that margin. So the data we have, I mentioned we have this detailed data from many households. There's smart meter data. We have it for a year and a half. So it's hourly data for the households that belong to a given company, regulated company. It's kind of the distribution territory. And for them, we know their hourly electricity, which is very detailed. We also know some things about their plan. And here also being in Spain helps a lot. We know the tariff they are in. We know, are they in the regulated tariff, en la PBOPC? Are they in a normal tariff or a commercial tariff? And we also know the potencia contractada, the contracted power, which, as you know, is an important part of their bill. Importantly, it's also a very good predictor of income because la potencia contratada, contracted power, tends to be highly correlated with income. So these are the things that we will use at the household level to infer income. And additionally, we have the postal code. So from the census, we will get the distribution of income for every postal code, and we will use that as well to infer income and get at the distributional impacts of real-time pricing. This is just a map, and you will see yourself in a map. This is the area of the data that we have. Yes. So this is to give you a snapshot of what going to real-time pricing means in our data. So imagine the dotted line that we see in this graph. This would be the average price during the entire period. So if a consumer managed to get, by the way, you can notice how low these prices are, but if a household managed to be on that price, it would mean that their energy price would be about 60 euros per megawatt hour every day and every hour of the year. So that would be full insurance. We will consider who are the winners and the losers of losing full insurance, for example, to go to monthly insurance. You can see that in monthly insurance, there are still price fluctuations, but within a month, there's a still price volatility. And then finally, real-time pricing is the one where there is no insurance at all, and there are large fluctuations throughout the year and within a day. So what we will do to analyze the distributional impacts will be very simple. We will basically first compute what would be the bill of a household with and without real-time pricing. So we will ask, what would be the bill if the price were flat? What would be the bill if the price were kind of monthly? And what would be the bill if the price were very volatile? And then we will ask who are the winners and who are the losers. So an important assumption that we will make initially is that consumers are inelastic to prices. So we will compute the bills with these different prices, assuming that the quantity is fixed. The justification for that assumption is that in our sample period, we find in a previous paper that households did not respond to prices. Obviously, it's quite different now that prices are so high. Obviously, people are responding more. So in our counterfactuals, when we do some simulations, we will try to ask, okay, what would happen if people responded? But for our sample period, it seems reasonable to assume, given the previous evidence that we have collected, that households did not respond to the more volatile prices. So then we will take these different bills, a bill with and without real-time pricing, and we will ask who are the winners and who are the losers and how that relates to income. That's kind of the paper. So the part of computing the bills, which is the next slide, is very simple, this one, because the quantity, as I said, we assume it's fixed. So it's as simple as computing how much does electricity cost under different prices. So as a summary statistic, we can compare what's the bill with a flat price, completely flat price, versus the bill with RTP. Actually, this is the comparison of monthly. You can see the monthly subscript, the monthly price versus the RTP bill. We also do the yearly price. And if you go to the next slide, you will see that monthly price variation generates most consumers to win or lose something between 2% to 4%. If you go to the next slide. Here, by the way, we by construction, we center this to be around 0 because we want to focus on the cross-subsidization from removing insurance. In practice, the RTP tariff used to be very attractive and it used to be cheaper for everyone. So going from RTP to a commercial tariff typically was associated with, during this period, was associated with a higher bill. Obviously, today is not the case because electricity prices are so high. But during our sample period, you can think of the distribution. In reality, everyone was benefiting under RTP because it was just a cheaper tariff. We centered it around 0 to focus on the distributional impacts of insurance, as I said. So the challenge we have is the income data, that we only observe the distribution of income at the zip code level. And as you know, código postales are quite big. So it would be good if we could get into more detail. So the idea, as I said, was to try to infer income a bit better by exploiting the data. And this is what I will explain now. So this is when I will put some notation. So the question is, okay, now that we know how much they pay under different tariffs, how can we relate this to income? So let me show you some notation. So if we have zip codes that we will include as Z, we know the income bins of each zip code. So we have some national income bins, the first quintile, second quintile. And then we have households for every zip code. On top of that, this is what we know. We know how many people are in the first quintile, how many people are in the second quintile, and so on and so forth for every zip code. So if I have a zip code 36005, I know that 15% of people are in the first quintile. What we do not know is, in our data, the households that we observe, what their expected distribution of income is, and this is what we will try to improve on. So the way we will do this, one potential naive approach would be to just take the distribution of income of the zip code. So we could say, okay, if in this zip code 15% of people are in the first quintile, I'm going to assume that every household in the zip code has a 15% probability of being low income. But obviously, we would be missing a lot of classification that happens within the zip code. We would be getting at across zip code differences, but not so much within. So this is what we will try to do by adding some more objects. We will take a discrete type approach, and we will try to simplify the data by reducing its dimension and getting at that classification a bit better. So we will define discrete types data, and these are the ways in which we're trying to classify households. So you can imagine taking the smart meter data and using some machine learning to put people into buckets. So some people are bucket 1, some people are bucket 2, depending on how they consume electricity. For example, if you are a professional that's never home, you will go in bucket 3. If you're someone that works from home, you might go on bucket 1. So think of classifying people into different buckets. What we will do then is, instead of trying to guess the zip code, if you can still stay in the previous one. So what we will do is, instead of trying to infer the probability of income of every single household, that it would be very difficult, we will try to infer the probability of income, the distribution of income of these buckets. And that's kind of a way to reduce the dimension of the data, because we only have to estimate these eras, which are the probability that each type has a given income. So the key for the method is to make some assumptions so that these eras are identified. So in the first step, we will classify the consumers into these buckets that I was talking about. And in the second step, we will try to infer the distribution of income of these different buckets. The idea is to allow for sufficient discrete heterogeneity so that we can be rich about the data, but under the assumption that there are common types across subsets of zip codes. So we cannot be fully flexible. We need to assume that 2 zip codes that are nearby, they share the same kind of people, so that we have enough moments to identify these objects. So the next slide should be the most clarifying, I think. Imagine we have 2 zip codes, 1 and 2, and we have 2 buckets, 2 types of people, A and B. And imagine we have run a first algorithm that has told us that some people are more likely to be type A and some people are more likely to be type B. So now imagine that we find that zip code 1 has more type A people and zip code 2 has more type B people. What we are trying to identify is the probability that type A is high income and the probability that type B is high income. These would be these red and orange parameters. So what we do in our paper is to precisely under the assumptions that there are some type A in zip code 1 and some type A in zip code 2, use the distribution of income of the zip code to infer whether type A is more likely or less likely to be high income. So back to our example, you can see that zip code 1 has more type A people. Now imagine that on top of that, zip code 1 is low income. Then we would be saying that type A is more likely to be low income, and that would be coming from this set of equations. So this is only 2 zip codes and 2 types, but we do this more generally in a GMM constrained GMM approach, where we try to match. This would be the next slide, where we try to match the observed distribution of income, which is this probability of Z at the zip code level. We try to match it by estimating these different areas. Under the constraint that the areas are a distribution and therefore they add up to 1. So this is what how we estimate these areas that give us in some ways a better guess of what's the distribution of income of a given household. Imagine that we have a household and we have inferred that it's type A. Before running this method, we would be inferring that that household has the same exact distribution as everyone in that zip code. But after running this algorithm, we will say that they have the income distribution of type A. So the first step, I haven't talked much about it, but it's assigning households to types. I haven't talked much about it because you can do it in many ways. And honestly, we're not being the most fancy that we could, because with machine learning, you could really find many innovative ways of classifying households. For the results I will present today, we used k-means clustering based on the profiles of consumption of the households. And that seems to be very robust, but we have done it in many other ways. One interesting approach that we do, and I'll show you some results on that, is that we also use machine learning to infer whether people have an air conditioner or not, and whether people have heating or not. The idea is that with the hourly data and temperature data, you can see whether electricity consumption starts to spike when it's really hot, and then you classify people into having an air conditioner. So these are other ways in which we classify households that also seem to be informative. And we have tried a bunch of more. So for the k-means clustering, which is what I will present today, what we do is first simplify the smart meter data because it's so many hourly consumption points per household that it was hard to k-means cluster based on that. So we simplify the data of the households by looking at the market shares of consumption at every hour. So are you a household that consumes more at night? Are you a household that consumes more into the day? We also put some seasonal moments. Are you a household that consumes more in the winter? Are you a household that consumes more in the summer? Which obviously helps with the air conditioning and heating. And then based on this simpler data, we classify people. On the second step, once we already have that, it's basically solving for the GMM that I already showed you and inferring the probability of income of these different types that we already classified. So imagine we do this, we classify people, and then we estimate the probability of income of these different types. We can basically go to our data, back to our data, and do some sanity checks. So if you can go past 242. This is what I already showed you, so here. So one thing that we checked is that we are predicting higher income for people with higher contracted power, which we know is something that's true. And this is what this is showing you. So the yellow bars is the distribution of income of people with high contracted power, and you can see that it's much, much right shifted than the probability of income of those with low contracted power. We also confirm that high-income households are more likely to consume on peak. So here we separate households on whether they consume during high demand hours or low demand hours, and we do confirm that the high income consume more, that people who consume on high demand hours tend to be higher income. So this is very related to the distributional impacts that I was mentioning, because typically going from monthly to hourly prices benefits low income, because the high income are the ones that are creating the peak and therefore are the ones who are paying the higher prices. This, by the way, can change quite a bit with solar panels. Bringing it back to these policy incomes, policy impacts, what we do is basically use this finer measure of income to see who are the winners and who are the losers under this policy, and to examine what's the relevance of within zip code heterogeneity that we would be missing. So first, some findings. We find that using a naive approach, even though we have zip codes that are extremely diverse in terms of income, and we have provinces and autonomous communities that are quite different, we find that the cross zip code heterogeneity suggests that income is not a huge explanatory variable on who wins and who loses, and it's basically almost flat. This is another way to put this, is that there seems to be a lot of heterogeneity within each income bin in who are the winners and who are the losers. By doing the GMM, you can see that we are able to classify the impacts a bit better. And what we find is that the low income are on average more impacted than the low income, although the effects are still quite small. This is in part because we still find, if you go to the next slide, we still find that there is a lot of within income being heterogeneity. So these are the winners and the losers in percentages within each income quintile. And you can see that the first quintile is the one that suffers the most because it has more on the loss. It's the one that has the higher losses. For example, there's more people above 4% that lose more than 4% in the first quintile. But within each quintile, we still have a lot of unexplained noise. This is important because we find that appliance ownership is a big driver of who are most impacted. And appliance ownership, particularly with respect to heating, is quite diverse in Spain. And it correlates with income, but it's not perfectly correlated with income. So whether people have natural gas heating, for example, can depend quite a bit on whether they live in a big city or not. But within the city, people of very diverse ranges of income use the same heating source. So these are some of the reasons behind these differences. And I'll go into some of these differences in more detail. First of all, I will look at the price variation decomposition. So remember the graph I showed you? I showed you going from hourly to monthly and monthly to annual. So we try to see this decomposition. So if we go to the next slide, this is a little bit what I already anticipated. So if we think about going from hourly prices to monthly prices, the low income are not losing from this policy. It's really the high income that pay more when they are consuming a lot, when they are creating the peak. So we find that the regressive aspect is really coming through winter, and it's basically making it less progressive. If you think that you can provide insurance during the year, this would benefit households compared to monthly prices that can change every year. It would benefit low-income households. So we look at the mechanisms, and I was mentioning appliances. I'll talk about that. Also, more generally, consumption patterns and geographical variation are important. So when we look at the consumption patterns, this might be a bit small, at least on my phone. But if you squint at these lines, you will see what I was telling you about. The first graph is the hourly profile during a given day. And you can see that the fifth quintile is the one that has the highest market shares during the high price hours. This would be the evening. So this is behind this result that going from hourly to monthly benefits the low income. And this is basically the the hourly within our profile. When it comes to annual, it really depends on appliance ownership. And you can see here in this appliance ownership, this is to remind you, we infer from the smart meter data whether people own AC or whether people own electric heating. And then we look at whether people win or lose. And we basically find that people are much more likely to lose if they have heating or both AC and heating. So we find it's a very important driver. It is very important when it comes to energy poverty. For example, there is now huge concern about energy poverty, and definitely for people who rely on electricity or natural gas, for that matter, which is so expensive, this will be a big driver. When it comes to appliance ownership and income, here what I showed you is whether households are low income or high income and whether they have heating. And you can see here that even low income households consume a lot during the day, during the winter. These graphs are for the winter. So during the winter, the low income households have quite a lot of demand, maybe not as high as the high income households, but much higher than high-income households without heating. So this is why this is a much more important driver than income itself. And we can see that during the year, that can drive the inequity impacts. So in some sense, the regressive aspect that we are finding, it's driven by the low-income households with electric heating that really suffer with volatile winter prices. When we look at geographical heterogeneity, we find that it's quite similar across regions. So if we look at the regions, the overall effect is similar. However, what we do find is that the annual effects, the fact that in the winter, the first one is the hourly differences, and the hourly differences, it's the same no matter the region. The rich tend to consume in the high price hours, and therefore it's a progressive policy to move into that kind of pricing. But when it comes to the seasonal differences, which is the other graph, the graph on the right, we can see that depending on the region, it can be progressive or it can be regressive, and it really depends on this appliance ownership, whether people heat themselves with electricity. So it was a surprise to us, but in Castilla y León, we didn't have a lot of electric heating. I guess it might be other sources, but in other parts of the country, electric heating is associated more with the low income. This is particularly true in Madrid, which is driving the overall effect. And my intuition, if anyone has any thoughts, my intuition is that in Madrid, most of the heating is done via city gas, natural gas. But the older buildings or the buildings that are least updated, they basically have no heating, and people heat themselves with electricity. What I call informal electric heating. It's not some fancy heat pump that's providing great electricity. It's rather great heating. It's rather different things that you apply at home and that can be highly inefficient. And this is driving these energy poverty concerns in the winter. So this is more or less the findings. What we do then in the paper is to do some counterfactual experiments. So basically, because we have the data, we can do some models to try to see what would happen if people behave differently. The big thing that we can try is to see what happens if we allow people to respond to prices. Remember, everything I did, I was not allowing people to change their behavior. And we have run several of these experiments. We have also now, based on what's happening now, done some experiments on extreme prices, like what we are seeing nowadays. And obviously, it makes the inequity impacts even larger. And again, it's driven by households who live in places with very inefficient heating. So when it comes to elasticity effects, obviously, we expect the low income to reduce their heating if prices become very high, but obviously it can become dangerous. So this is an important welfare question to ask. We haven't put numbers to that yet. When it comes to the hourly patterns, our initial assumption in the counterfactuals is actually that the high income will be much more able to respond to prices than the low income. And this is at least what we are seeing in certain parts of the US, where the energy transition is very much along, and this would be California. So the high income are putting solar panels and batteries, and they basically have hedged themselves against any price fluctuations, whereas the low income are now much less elastic. So these are all counterfactuals we are putting in the paper. I don't have the final results yet, but these are things we are excited about. Yes. So this was more or less what I wanted to present. I'm sorry that you cannot even see me. I will try to put the camera now and see if it cooperates for the Q&A
session. Well, thank you so much, Mari. It was excellent, and you have a great capacity to concentrate and to communicate in spite of not having a camera.
Now you can see me, right?
Yeah, I can see you. So thanks so much for this. It's excellent work, Mar. I'm sure my colleagues have a lot of questions, and I'm gonna just give them the floor. But in the meantime, before they when they start preparing, just let me ask you a very quick one, and then I open the floor. Your naturgy data is super interesting. I was wondering if you have the, en castellano, el bono social. Do you have data on the bono social?
Yeah, that's a very good question. We did not have data on the bono social here. At some point, we thought maybe we could infer it. What we definitely show is that I didn't show you that graph. Our inferred measure of income, the income is inferred to be lower if you are under the real-time pricing tariff, because as you know, to be in the bono social, you have to be in the PBPC. So we do find that people under the PBPC are more likely to be low income. During the sample period, it benefited them because it was the cheapest tariff. So it was not bad for them, actually. One potential drawback for that is that there's more and more papers showing that the low income are also least likely to shop around. Mm-hmm. So it's a bit hard to separate whether people are on the PBOPC more because they are on the bono social or because they are searching less and it's a default tariff basically. Unfortunately, we don't have that data. Yeah.
When I was listening to you, I was thinking, if she has bono social or if she could request it, because I'm sure they have it, that would be awesome for her to identify her households. And so we have some questions here in the chat, Mar. Like, for instance, Jorge Perez is asking, to what extent were you able to account for different characteristics, climatic characteristics in the regions in Spain? And in that sense, if we think about that, there is also like a potential area in which you could collect data, because IMET has stations, climate stations in which you could collect outside temperature, humidity, and so on and so forth, which are highly relevant in order to determine consumption and differences in consumption patterns. I don't know if you thought about that.
Yes, we used IMET data precisely to get at household-specific zip code-specific temperature, because we don't know where they are in the zip code. So we use that to classify households using a different method, and we also use that same data, the IMET data, for inferring whether people have air conditioning and heating. Okay. To me, I was a bit surprised that we don't find bigger differences across regions, more generally, but yes, that's what we kind of found. The only region that seems to be a bit different is, as I mentioned, Castilla y León, because of the electric heating. I wonder what's the alternative for the low income, and I was thinking maybe it is wood, like a stove. I'm wondering, but we don't seem to find this correlation of inefficient electric heating in the low-income bin.
I see your point. Miguel also has a question. So, Miguel, maybe you can enter.
Sí.
Hacer la pregunta, Miguel.
¿Me escucháis, verdad?
Sí.
Bueno, buenos días. Muchas gracias, Mar, por la presentación. Yo soy Miguel Rodríguez y trabajé más en el pasado que ahora bastante en temas de economía de la energía y cambio climático. Y ahora me estoy más interesado, me ocupo más de temas de economía circular, pero no abandoné esa otra etapa. Muchas gracias por la presentación, muy interesante. Es un tema muy de actualidad, el tema de la distribución, los efectos distributivos, ya sea del diseño de mercado en términos de precios, subsidios, feed-in tariffs y todo este tema. Me parece muy bien la solución que has encontrado con Machine Learning, o puede haber otras similares, para solventar el problema de que no puedes identificar bien los hogares en relación a qué tipo de electrodomésticos o instalaciones de consumo de energía tienen en su hogar. Yo creo que efectivamente por el perfil de cómo va entrando en cada hora o a lo largo del tiempo, a lo largo del año, pues uno puede identificar más o menos o clasificar los hogares en función de la instalación que tiene. Te pierdes alguna información que va a ser difícil que lo puedas corregir, como cómo deficientes son los electrodomésticos que cada uno tiene en su casa, y normalmente los que tienen más renta tienen mejores electrodomésticos. Solo te quería comentar una cosa, y es un problema, una dificultad grande que tienes, que tú has mencionado, que tiene que ver con identificar el nivel de renta. Y hay una fuente de datos que no has mencionado y podría ser la gran fuente de datos para corregir razonablemente bien ese problema, que es la encuesta de presupuestos familiares. Ahí tienes mucha información muy rica, con información sobre el consumo de diferentes fuentes energéticas a lo largo de los meses. Yo la he utilizado en mi tesis hace muchos años. Y además de poder identificar qué tipos de electrodomésticos pueden tener cada uno de los hogares, que eso puede ser un poco más discutible dependiendo de cómo esté elaborada la encuesta o cómo se recogen los datos, pero lo que sí tienes es información sobre la renta de cada hogar y su localización. Y eso te puede ser muy útil para hacer esa clasificación más fina de los hogares en función de su renta. No sé si lo has pensado.
Sí que lo pensamos. El problema, déjame pensar, lo utilizamos un poquitito, ¿eh? Cuando intentamos inferir si la gente tiene aire acondicionado o heating, intentamos machear a los shares que vemos de la encuesta en la provincia. Lo que pasa es que, si recuerdo bien, la encuesta solo salía a la provincia, pero quizá me estoy equivocando. Entonces, a la provincia ya intentamos ser tan flexibles como podemos, pero nos cuesta hacerlo más granular, pero es verdad que podríamos machear momentos a nivel de provincia, que no lo hemos hecho. Sí que se podría hacer.
También lo que se puede hacer, esto es algo que se ha utilizado en muchas ocasiones para otros trabajos, es intentar machear esta información que tienes para cada hogar con la medida del contador eléctrico, poder machear esta información de tipología por niveles de renta con tipología por perfil de consumo. Bueno, hay métodos para poder hacer esto, yo lo he visto. No lo llegué a usar nunca, pero sí que se puede hacer. Bueno, nada, simplemente ese comentario. Gracias, Mar.
No, es muy útil. Y lo utilizamos un poco para comprobar si las appliance ownership que hemos inferido más o menos, pero lo podríamos utilizar más. Estoy 100% de acuerdo. Sí.
¿Alguna otra pregunta de los asistentes? Creo que también, Mar, últimamente han puesto el código postal como una de las variables clave de la encuesta de presupuestos familiares. Por ello, a lo mejor a través del zip code, igual que tu otra fuente de datos, sí que puedes hacer un matching más fino.
Perfecto. Sí. Pues lo tenía mal mirado, entonces.
O el zip code, porque nosotros hemos utilizado el zip code para otra cosa. Y si no tuvieras en tu base de datos el zip code, creo que puedes solicitar al INE la base de datos con zip code.
Perfecto.
Y siguiendo criterios de privacidad y demás, si hay una muestra suficientemente representativa en esa zona que no viole ningún tipo de privacidad de los sujetos, pues creo que la dan y que la facilitan.
Qué bien.
Por si fuera de tu interés. ¿Alguna pregunta más? Carlos, adelante, Carlos.
Bueno,
Es un comentario que yo creo que el zip code es muy útil en ciudades como Madrid o Barcelona, pero en Galicia, por ejemplo, en particular en Vigo, en las zonas más ricas, y estoy pensando en muchas en concreto, conviven familias con altísima renta con familias de bajísima. Es muy frecuente aquí. Si un día te vienes a Vigo y te das una vuelta, cerca de esa 1000 hay gente de renta muy alta que vive pegada de renta muy baja, y en la zona de la Guía, que es un sitio precioso, pues pasa lo mismo. Hay unas casas impresionantes y otras muy modestas.
Sí, eso es un poco el objetivo del método, que nos parece que zip code es demasiado grande y que hay mucha heterogeneidad que nos perdemos. Precisamente, incluso Madrid me sorprendió, pero los zip codes son como enormes. En los datos para ciudades, los datos de renta están también a nivel de colegio electoral. Y estuvimos contemplando mirar a una distribución de la renta más granular a nivel de colegio electoral. Pero como la electricidad solo sabemos los zip codes, al final estuvimos haciendo un montón de heavy lifting y no nos daba mucha cosa porque al final solo sabemos el zip code. Pero sí, en las ciudades el zip code se queda, también es muy, muy grande el zip code, o sea que sí. Es precisamente por eso que intentamos hacer esto un poco así.
Que buscabas la heterogeneidad dentro de ECOBAS. Y es muy importante en sitios, yo creo que del norte en general y en Galicia en particular. Sí, gracias.
Muchas gracias.
¿Alguna otra pregunta, cuestión, sugerencia, idea para el futuro? Bueno, Mar tiene un montón de ideas para seguir trabajando, como nos indica.
Sí.
No sé si alguien quiere indicar o contribuir con algo antes de fechar la sesión. A mí también me parece, Mar, que has escogido una línea temática súper interesante en la que se habla muy poco de los efectos distributivos en esta transición energética y que, bueno, pues ya que si no hay más preguntas quizás podemos cerrar aquí por hoy, pero darte las gracias por haber tenido tiempo para atendernos hoy, para darnos este seminario excelente, contarnos qué estás haciendo y cómo lo estás haciendo y estas nuevas avenidas que estás explorando, y desearte la mejor de las suertes porque es realmente un tema súper interesante en el cual efectivamente no hay tantísima literatura todavía y hay mucho que aprender y que pensar para hacer unas políticas energéticas más justas, ¿no? Que de eso se trata. Así que, Mar, muchísimas gracias por tu tiempo. Gracias de nuevo de parte de todos, de ECOBAS. Ha sido un placer tenerte y esperamos que vengas físicamente, bien sea a Vigo, bien sea a Santiago de Compostela o La Coruña, ¿no? Porque somos un instituto interuniversitario, así que confiamos que puedas venir la próxima vez en persona y así ya nos conocemos un poco más en persona.